Welcome back. Just this morning, I was talking to my 16-year-old daughter about the importance of not procrastinating, that we just need to get those tasks done that we have been putting off. Well, I have been guilty of putting off some machine binding that I need to get done. Also, I've been getting requests for a machine binding tutorial. I am combining those two things, and I'm going to get at least one quilt done during this video, and I'm going to share with you a couple more quilts at the end of this video that I also need to get bound. And I'm hoping that you ask me in the comments if I've gotten those quilts bound yet and that I am able to say yes, they are done. So just hold me accountable to that. But let's get started on the first quilt. This is the quilt that I'm going to be binding for this tutorial. This is a whole cloth quilt using 2 yards of my Beautiful Day panel fabric with that red background, and it is custom quilted by Rebecca Silbaugh of Ruby Blue Quilting. She did just an amazing job on this quilt. But as you can see, no binding. So let's get that taken care of. Get this one checked off my list. I have gone ahead and cut out the binding strips, fabric that I will need. I like cutting my binding for machine binding at 2 inches. I'm using this red striped fabric, also from Beautiful Day, and I'm going to go ahead and sew this together into continuous machine binding. I'll show you how to do that at my sewing machine. I am here at my sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how I like to sew my strips together. I prefer doing a diagonal join for these strips. You can do a straight join just like you normally would with like piecing, just do a straight join, but I find that that creates more bulk in my binding, so I actually prefer to do a diagonal seam when I'm joining binding. So I will place my 2 strips right sides together at a 90-degree angle, just line everything up. And I'm going to be sewing diagonally from here down to, well, let me show you here, right where that meets, right here. And so usually what I'll do, I'm going to use my diagonal seam tape, which you see here. I've just completed a video where I show how I use diagonal seam tape, so that will be helpful for you if you're not familiar with this product. I use it a lot, and this is one of the times that I use it. So what I have done is I've lined up my top point, and then I just flip this up here and make sure that that bottom point right there is right on the red line of this tape. Now you could also mark a diagonal line if you don't have tape. You would mark a diagonal line right from the needle straight down to where that point meets this edge, if that makes sense. Using the tape makes it so easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew this together here, just making sure that I keep that point lined up on my red line. And then I'll continue sewing my binding strips together just like that until I have all of my strips sewn. This binding for this quilt uses 7 strips, so I will sew all of these together. Usually I'll do a couple stitches, make sure that lines up right like that, and then keep sewing. And this is how I like to do my binding. I don't worry about pattern matching. You'll notice me lining things up like this before I join. It's because I want my numbers going the same direction. So I'll switch it to going that direction, which is just a little pickiness on my part. It doesn't have to have numbers going the same direction. I just like them all uniform. And I'll just continue on until I have all of these sewn together. And then I will show you the next step after that. I want to show you another shot, making sure my hand stays out of the way so that you can see a little bit more easily what I'm doing. So I have lined my needle and my top fabric up here, and now I'm just guiding these strips back, making sure that that point right there stays on my red line. I'm going to try to do this one-handed, but that way you'll get a better idea of how this looks. And then I'll just continue. I have just one more to go, so I'll show this last one to you yet also. And then we'll be ready for the next step. Let me line this up and then I'll move my hands out of the way again. I'm going to sew just a couple stitches to tack it down. Okay, so I've got that attached, and then there's that bottom lined up again. And like I said, you can sew a diagonal, or not sew, you can draw a diagonal line right across this top piece here if you don't have tape like I do that you would be using. And that is all of the strips. So let me show you the next step. All right. Now all I'm doing is I am going and cutting apart all of these strips. I've done the first little bit here. I'm just cutting these apart, separating those threads where I had chain pieced everything together. And the last one, there we go. And then I will trim off my little edges. Find the end. Here we go. Okay, I'll trim these off here a 1/4 inch, and I just do this with a scissors. Once I get these trimmed, we're going to talk about this little board you see in front of me. It has sped up pressing binding quite a bit. I think it's such a neat find. It's called a binding board. So I'm going to show you how that works next once I get these trimmed up here. Just a 1/4 inch is all I'm doing off of these joins. Okay, last one. All right. Now, let me show you how fun this is. This is a binding board, and I would not usually use this on my cutting board. I usually just lay this right on top of my ironing board because it can get hot underneath of it. It's just a plywood, or probably not plywood, it's thicker than that, but a piece of wood there, and then some filling in there and the cover. And let me show you how this works. I'm going to link to this gadget in my description so you can, I mean, you might want one for yourself. I don't know. I think it's so handy. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to start this edge here just on the fold. And I have found that I don't need to have my iron as hot as I think I do in order to press this binding. So I usually keep it no steam, and then either medium to medium high on my temperature setting. And I'll talk about my iron a little bit here too. I use just this inexpensive Hamilton Beach iron. I've used all kinds of irons from expensive to cheap, and I find that I'm very happy with an inexpensive iron, and then if it quits working or starts spitting or doing something like that, I don't have any problem replacing it. So this is my second one of this brand, and I really like it. I like this iron quite a bit. It has good steam and it does the trick great. So if you purchase one of these binding boards, it will tell you, and it actually comes with these pins. You have to place them a certain width apart, and it tells you how to put those in so that you can use this for your binding. And then all you do is you just set your iron down, and you're just gonna pull this through. My iron has an automatic shut off, so I do sometimes have to put it back up and back down to start it up again. But I think this is just a time saver, and I don't even go as fast as you can go. Like, I've seen people use this and they are just going lickety split through here. You don't even have to press your joints. It will do that right for you as you're going. See, there it's shutting off. Sometimes I'll just leave it down a little bit and then catch it. Oops. Catch it on the way back. There we go. Not quite sure what I was saying. Catch it on the way back. That doesn't make much sense. I think I meant just leave it down for a little bit and then get it after a moment. So maybe you're fast at doing this without this, but I think this is fun. Makes pressing binding a little interesting. Get that seam laying nice and flat there. There it goes. Sometimes I'll have to pivot that back up. But this is how this works. It's kind of fun. I'll often join a whole bunch of binding strips at once and then just come and do this all at once. And I do line it up a little bit here on the left side. My iron is pretty hot. It gets pretty toasty over here on the right side as it comes through. You really don't need to have it that warm. There's some kind of reflective material underneath the cover that really absorbs the heat. your iron might not have an automatic shut off like mine does, and you might be able just to leave it down, but actually sometimes I'm glad that it shuts off for a little bit because it cools off just a little bit and it still does a really nice job pressing. So I will link, like I said, to this board down in my description so you can check it out yourself. The lady who sells these probably has a video too where you can watch her doing it and you'll see how much faster she is than me. And I still find this to be a really efficient way to press binding. Even going this speed, I still find it faster. I'm going to continue pressing this and I'll meet you back here in just a second. Back at the sewing machine, my binding is complete. I did want to let you know that the bottom of that binding board did not get hot the whole time that I sewed this. So that was nice to know. I wasn't sure if it would get warm or not, but it really didn't, which was great. I have the binding laid on my quilt. I have left a tail of, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 inches that I'm just letting hang up at the top of the quilt. And I have put on my 1/4 inch foot, sewing machine foot, and I am just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. I'm starting on the back side of the quilt. When I do machine binding, I like to bind from the back and then finish on the front. So that's what you're going to see me do. I have tried a lot of different machine binding techniques, and this is the one that I like the best right now. That could change, you never know, but this has been my favorite for a number of years. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing, and just a 1/4 inch seam allowance the whole way down through. I'm going to go all the way down to the corner, and I will show you how I do a corner once we get there. I switched to doing machine binding a number of years ago. I used to always do it all by hand, but I have so many quilts that I need to machine bind in a year. This is a lot nicer. It's going to take a little bit of practice. Sometimes seams don't line up quite as you'd like them to, so it will take you a little bit of practice, but if you keep doing it, it will come together for you. Pillows, table runners, those are great projects to try machine binding on. We're getting close to the edge, a little bit further. I managed to have my join right at my corner, which isn't ideal. You can lay out your binding ahead of time so that you don't have that happen. If that happens, I don't lay out my binding ahead of time, so sometimes that happens for me, and I just let it fall where it falls. And you'll kind of see how this is going to work. Now I'm going to come up to a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my quilt, and then I'm going to back stitch, kind of lock that in place. And about right there. You can mark your 1/4 inch if you're not good at eyeballing it. I usually just kind of eyeball that 1/4 inch. Back stitch that, take it all the way out of my machine, and then pivot my quilt around here. I'm going to try to get it so it doesn't fall off my cutting table. All that quilt hanging off the left side here. Okay. I've got it turned around, and then when you come to a corner, what you'll do is you're going to flip this up. I'll move my hand here. You're going to flip that on that side. Flip this up so that you have a 90-degree, nice 90-degree diagonal coming right up into that corner, and then you're going to flip it right back down. So it makes this nice little fold here. That's going to give you a really nice corner. So everything should be lined up. Your raw edge will be lined up here. You've got a nice corner up here. I'm gonna do that again so that you can see how that looks. So you've got your binding here coming straight across. Just gonna flip it right up, straight up. So you have a nice diagonal going right into your corner. Then you can kind of crease that down, and then you're just gonna flip this right back down. You want that fold laying right at the top of your quilt edge, and then your raw edges should be all lined up coming down. And then you're just gonna take that back into your machine. And I usually backstitch this also just a little bit. Got a little bit more bulk in there because I do have my binding strips are joined right there. And then we just come down through and we're gonna keep sewing all the way down. I'm gonna do all my corners the same way. And when I get back around, I'm going to show you how to join your binding strips right at the completion of attaching it. So I'll be right back. I have finished sewing around the whole perimeter of the quilt, and I've come just around the last corner and I've sewn about 1 inch or so, and that's all the further that I want to go. I don't have very far to go till I reach where I need to join these, so I'm just going to backstitch right here and then take this out and show you how to cut these and sew these together to finish this binding. So this part is done. I'm going to move my sewing machine out of the way so I can use my cutting mat and show you that part. I have my quilt top laid out in front of me. This is the first binding strip where we started, and this is where I'm coming around the corner here from where I am ending. What I do, you'll lay out this nice and straight with your quilt top, and then this one is going to also be laid out following the raw edge here. What you want to do is line up this raw edge and then fold this one back. So you're going to fold it back just so the two meet. And then whatever width you cut your binding at, I cut mine at 2 inches. So I want to leave a 2-inch tail facing this way. So I want this to be 2 inches longer from the fold. If you cut 2.5 inch binding, you will cut 2.5 inches from the fold. 2.25 inch, same deal, 2.25 from the fold. Usually what I will do, I'll just take my ruler here and go over 2 inches. And then I find if I go just a little bit less than 2 inches, then if there is any tugging or pulling as I'm sewing, it just lays a little bit nicer. I don't have any extra binding fabric. So I'll measure 2 inches and then, you know, I might take a 1/4 inch off. I'm just gonna go right here. So that is actually about 1 3/4. So that's entirely up to you if you wanna go just a little bit smaller. Maybe if you do a 2 1/4 inch binding, you wanna do 2 1/8 or something like that. It's up to you. That's what I find works nice. The other way that you can measure this over, if you don't want to use a ruler, if you don't have one handy, so you can just take your one edge of your binding, open it up, and lay that on top. Lay it like that. And that will tell you how far you need to go as well. And then I would still go just a little bit shorter than that. I find that to work really nicely. Once you have your binding cut, and another tip, save these binding strips. If you always cut your binding at the same width, you can easily sew these together to make scrappy binding. So I always save these, unless I happen to have just a wee little bit left, but usually I have enough that I will save. Once you have these strips cut, you're going to join them exactly as you joined originally. So just like so. Place them, and then you're going to sew from this point down to where the fabrics meet, right down here. And I'm going to show you that on my machine so you can see how that works. Back at my sewing machine, you can see how things are laying here. What you'll do is you're just going to pick these two pieces up and put them right sides together, lining them up just like you did when you made your continuous binding. And we're going to sew from this point up here right down to that point underneath there. Let me get this lined up here. This is a little bit trickier to do standing up rather than sitting at my machine, so we'll see what happens here. I'm going to try to stay out of the way so you can see how things come together. Okay. And I did switch my sewing machine foot back to the, not my 1/4 inch foot, so I don't have, my 1/4 inch foot has a little arm on the side of it, so I usually switch when I am attaching, or when I'm sewing my binding strips together. So let me do a couple stitches there. Ooh, and I'm way off. Look how far. Like if I flip that up, you can see I am nowhere close to that red line. So I'm just going to pivot that back down to the red line there. And then that's where I'm going to want to be sewing, right there. So let me line that back up and then we'll sew. Okay. There we go. And then what I will do is I will go and trim off my 1/4 inch seam allowance, press this, press those, so that my binding is once again a continuous binding. And then all I need to do is come back over here and finish attaching it to my quilt. The binding is all finished, it's joined, pressed, and the seam allowance is trimmed back. We're ready to sew this last stretch of binding. I have put my 1/4 inch foot back on. I really like having that accurate 1/4 inch when I'm doing binding. It just helps me be more accurate. I'll back stitch a little bit there to start, and then we're just gonna finish this off. It's a little harder to do this standing than it is sitting down. We're getting there. All right. And then once I meet up to where I started, I'm going to do a little back stitch here as well. And it's all attached. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to take this over to my iron and I am going to press this binding all firmly out. This was a step that I didn't start doing until a couple of years ago, but it's an important step to do, is just press all of the binding out. When you get down here to your corners, you're just going to give those a press out as well. Just press everything out so you have a nice crisp binding. That's going to make doing the top stitching on the front so much nicer. I'm going to go do that, and then I will show you how I like to top stitch the binding in place from the front. Back from pressing, you can see how nicely this lays now. It makes the biggest difference. It just lays so much nicer than if you don't iron it before you try to stitch it from the front. I switched my foot back again. I do a lot of foot switching when I am doing binding, but this is the foot I like to have for my machine binding. Now, this is a Juki, this is a hinged presser foot, so you might have this same foot. If you don't, you don't need to use a certain foot, but what I do find to be helpful is you may want to try different feet to see what you like and what works best on your machine. I like this one because I know if I line up my binding, my folded edge of binding when it's flipped over like this, I know if I line it up with that inside edge right there, it's gonna fall just where I want it to. So depending on your machine, your feet options, I would encourage you to play around a little bit with your different feet to see if some of them cause your seam to lie a little bit nicer on the front, and then also to lay really nicely back here. I like my seam to run right along that that little ditch part right there, and this foot does really well for that, but it's going to vary from machine to machine, so that might be something you'll need to experiment with. What I like to do now is to take some Wonder clips and just tack these into place, tack this binding down into place. I'll use just a few. I don't like to have too many at a time, and I space them out a couple inches, and this just keeps your binding really in place nicely while you're sewing. Now, you'll remember at the beginning of this tutorial, I said I like to cut my binding at 2 inches. And right now is exactly why, because I can pull my binding tight against that edge of my quilt, and it's all going to be tight against. This is going to fall the same the whole way up the front. If I were to cut it at 2 1/4 or 2 1/2, I would have more room that I could, pull this over a little bit more or have it not pulled quite as tight. And that is going to affect your seam on the back side. I love being able to just pull this tight and know that it's going to be uniform the whole way around the edge of the quilt. Okay, so I have Wonder clipped just a bit. And now I'm going to start top stitching, and I top stitch it here it's pretty close to the edge. It's not even 1/8 of an inch from the edge. It's just right, you know, maybe 3-4 threads from that folded edge is where I am sewing. So I'm going to start here, do a back stitch, and then I'll just keep on going. I go a lot slower when I do this than when I sew to the back because I want to make sure and hit the edge of that. I'm going to try to move my hand out of the way here so you can see. So this part does take a little bit longer. And I'll just move the wonder clips out of the way as I get to them. And I pull that tight up against the edges I'm sewing. And again, it's easier to do when you're seated and when I don't have to worry about getting my hands in view. But I think you can get a really nice idea of how this works. I'm gonna cruise on down here to the corner and then I will show you how I do one of the corners. Just keep it all tight as I go. We're going to stop 1/4 inch away, just like we did before. Come right up to the edge. And this seam line here that you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but when you're actually sitting at your machine sewing your binding on, the seam line that you near, that is your 1/4 inch. So you'll come right up to it and then back stitch right there. And then we're going to take it out of the machine. We'll pivot. So this is what our corner looks like right now. You can kind of give that a nice little crease and then we'll just fold this right in. You want a nice miter there and that'll meet right. I think you can see that. That'll meet right like that. And then we're just going to bring this into the machine, kind of pull that over. And I usually don't put my wonder clips on just right away until I have sewn this down. Okay. I'll back stitch this into place here and then go a little bit there. And then I will go ahead and wonder clip again, get everything nice and tight, and then keep sewing around. And you're just going to continue that way around the whole perimeter of the quilt. You'll do all of your corners that way. And then you will have your binding complete. I will finish this up and then I'm going to show you what the stitching looks like from the front, and then I will flip it over and show you what that looks like on the back. So let me take a little bit of time and get this wrapped up. All right, our binding is complete. And just like that, machine binding. I want to show you guys what it looks like on the back here, so you can see kind of how that seam is going to line up back here. It's running right here, right along the edge of the back. Now you could use a coordinating thread color. I often just keep whatever I have in my machine for piecing, which is Aurifil in the color 2021. So I often am using that for binding as well. Here's where it's running on the front, just right along that very edge. That's what that looks like. You could, what I was gonna say is you could match your thread color to your backing, or if you wanted to match it to the front, whatever you wanted to do. I often just leave that white in there. But that's what it looks like. One thing I did want to mention, with my 2-inch binding, I use a very low loft batting, and my machine quilters, when they are machine quilting my quilts, also use very low loft batting in with our quilts. So if you were going to use something thicker, you might have to go a little, you actually probably would have to go wider than 2 inches, because it would add bulk in that seam there, and so you wouldn't be able to pull it as far as you needed to be able to get what you needed. So maybe 2 1/8 or 2 1/4, something that you might want to play around with. I know I tried 2 1/2, 2 1/4, 2 1/8, and then landed on 2 because that was where I was happiest. So you might find that you need to make those adjustments too, to work with your batting preferences. And now I wanted to share the other quilts that I need to bind yet. I'm hoping, like I said, you guys leave me a little comment below and say, did you get your bindings done? And hopefully by the time this video goes up, I can say, yes, bindings are done. Mission accomplished. So let me show you. Let me put this over here. Let me show you. I have two quilts here on my table. They are both the same pattern, both using Beautiful Day fabrics, and they are both the Beautifully Charming quilts. So these are, this is a free pattern. It's on my blog. If you search Beautifully Charming, you'll find it. I will also link to it down in the description so that you can easily find this pattern. It's a charm pack quilt, easy to make, and a fun one. So we have it in gray, and I have a red one that I need to bind also. So this is the red one. I can't ever decide which one I like better, red or gray. I thought I was gonna like the gray one. That was the one that I designed first, but I don't know, guys. This red one is pretty cute. So this is the red one. Beautifully Charming is the name of the pattern. Again, charm pack quilt, Beautiful Day fabric. Needs binding. The last quilt is this little fella hanging here on my ladder. I made it look all nice and finished, but if you look down here at the bottom, it still needs bound too. This is Rosebud Waltz, and it's also Beautiful Day fabric. So those are the three. I'm sure there's more, but those are my top three that are priorities right now to get bound. So ask me if it got done. I hope you guys have found this tutorial to be helpful. There are lots of different machine binding techniques. So maybe something that I mentioned that I do might be helpful to incorporate in your favorite binding technique. I know I can always learn things when I watch someone else's way of binding. So I hope you find that to be the case for this tutorial as well. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope to see you here again soon.